Weather by Marcel Khalife. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, the Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times foreign correspondent Anthony Shadid died of an apparent asthma attack yesterday while reporting on the conflict in Syria. One of the most celebrated journalists covering the Middle East, 43-year-old Shadid, had been reporting inside Syria for a week, gathering information on the Free Syrian Army and other armed elements of the resistance to the government of President Bashar al-Assad. His photographer, Tyler Hicks, said Shadid had medication with him but began to show symptoms early Thursday before eventually suffering a fatal attack. Hicks later carried Shadid's body across the border to Turkey. He's survived by his wife and 2 children. An American of Lebanese descent who spoke fluent Arabic, Shadid captured dimensions of life in the Middle East that many others failed to see.
Anthony Shadid's exceptional coverage won him a Pulitzer Prize in 2004 for international reporting while he was at the Washington Post on the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the occupation that followed. The Pulitzer Board praised Shadid's, quote, extraordinary ability to capture at personal peril the voices and emotions of Iraqis as their country was invaded, their leader toppled, their way of life upended, unquote. Shadid won a second Pulitzer Prize at the Washington Post in 2010 also for his Iraq reporting and has since been nominated while at the New York Times for his coverage of the Arab Spring uprisings. This is Anthony Shadid reporting from Cairo for the New York Times last February, the night Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak was forced out.
This is Anthony Shadid from the New York Times in Cairo. In some ways, one revolution may have ended tonight with the overthrow of President Hosni Mubarak, and another revolution may have begun. People are already making comparisons between Egypt's revolution and some of the most seismic moments in the Arab world, the 1967 Middle East War, or even the American invasion of Baghdad. That Arab world faces many of the same challenges that Egyptian youth face today. That's a demographic that is going younger and younger, the role of governments that have never quite responded to their people's demands for democracy, ineffectiveness of bureaucracies, and entrenched interests of militaries, secret police, and big businesses that have profited off of neoliberal reforms across the region.
At last, after a lot of patience, the will of people won. The will of people won at last. At last he stepped down.
The test of how far these reforms go may prove the biggest challenge of Egypt's revolution. What the protesters were demanding over the past 18 days was a fundamental rethinking of Arab societies, the relationship of ruler to ruled. Already we've seen reverberations across the region: Jordan, Yemen, Algeria, perhaps even Syria, which is under one of the most autocratic forms of government. Even the most optimistic think these changes, these reforms, these changes in society may take months, years, perhaps even decades. But then again, no one expected Egypt's revolution to unfold as quickly as it did. 18 days later, and President Hosni Mubarak has fallen.
Anthony Shadid reporting for the New York Times in Cairo last February. His work entailed great peril. In 2002, he was shot in the shoulder while reporting in Ramallah in the West Bank for the Boston Globe. Last March, Anthony Shadid and 3 other New York Times journalists were kidnapped in Libya by Colonel Muammar Qaddafi's forces. They were held for 6 days, beaten before being released. Democracy Now! Spoke with Anthony Shadid shortly after he returned home. Today, we remember Anthony Shadid by going back to our interview with him in April of 2011. I began the interview by asking him to describe where he and his colleagues were at the time they were captured in Libya.
A day before I had gone back to Benghazi, I'd been covering the fighting at, I guess what you'd describe as the front in Libya, and I'd gone back to Benghazi, and I'd come that morning to a town called Ashdabia because I think there was a sense, and at least I had the sense that this battle for this town might prove decisive somehow, that how that battle went would determine, it would have broader repercussions, I think, on the war, the civil war that we're seeing in Libya today. We had spent the day reporting that the fighting did begin that morning. We had spent the day going from the hospital to the front, interviewing residents in the town, and by about 4 or 4:30, we decided, we kept on hearing rumors that the government was in the town, that government troops were in the town, and we didn't think that was happening. We thought they were still coming from the west. It turned out that they had encircled the town, and as we were leaving to go back to Benghazi, probably within a couple of minutes, we hit that checkpoint that they had set up just minutes before. The photographer, Lindsay, she saw the checkpoint first, and she thought it was government. We weren't sure. And I have to say, it felt like minutes, but it was probably just seconds when we drove right into the checkpoint. We passed the first line of soldiers, and then the second line of soldiers, I think, recognized that some people in the car were foreigners. And our driver yelled "journalist," and at that point they pulled us out of the car, and almost instantly, as they pulled us out of the car, a gun battle unlike anything we'd ever seen erupted. Rebels attacked the checkpoint, and we basically ran for our lives at that point.
So then talk about what happened. Who first took you? What happened at the checkpoint?
You know, there's that look, I think, there was a look, I think, in those soldiers' faces of just fear and rage as they saw us, and they pulled us out of the car. Like I said, the gun battle started immediately, and when we ran, Tyler ran first, and then I fell on a sand berm and got to my feet, and then I ran after him. And Tyler and Lindsay and Steve followed, and we got behind a kind of a concrete shack, basically, to take cover from the shooting. And the soldiers set upon us there. They emptied our pockets, slapped us, beat us, and forced us onto our knees. And then I think, again, I want to say it was minutes, but it was probably just seconds. They told us to get on our stomachs, to lay flat on our stomachs, and we all resisted. I mean, I think all of us had the idea that if we were going to get on our stomachs, we might be shot or executed. We resisted, and they forced us down. And I remember looking up, hearing, I remember him being a tall, lanky soldier saying, basically shoot them. And again, I'm sure it was just a matter of seconds, but it did feel like minutes. Another soldier, looked at him and said, you can't shoot them, they're Americans. And they soon after that, they tied our legs and our hands and threw us in 2 pickup trucks. And that kind of was the beginning of a 12-hour period where, I'd say every couple hours, every 3 hours, another gun battle, another fight with the rebels would start. We would pour out of the cars trying to take cover on the ground. And then by 2 a.m., they put us in a tank, drove us to another location, and that started a kind of a journey of 7 or 8 hours basically across the Libyan coast towards Sirte, where we were held in jail for a night.
And talk about who your captors were. Who were these soldiers, Anthony?
It was interesting, Amy, because I kept on hearing this, the soldiers refer to the doctor. And, pretty early on, you got a sense that it was more of a militia than an army. It was hard to identify any rank. Organization seemed a little bit haphazard. It was tough to see who was in charge or who wasn't in charge. And I kept on hearing this word, doctor. And then later on in the night, there was a reference to Dr. Mu'tasim, and this is one of Colonel Qaddafi's sons, considered, a hardliner, whatever that means. But and it did seem that militia was loyal to him. At the stop that they took us the next morning, it was made clear that we needed to be put in the hands of Mukhabarat, that they're going to put us in the hands of intelligence. And I think that was the reason for the journey to Sirte. Once we got to Sirte, which is a pretty strategic town for the government since it's Colonel Qaddafi's hometown, there was an effort to find out who we are, where we had come from, what we were doing, and then a decision by the next day was to take us to Tripoli, which we got to by a military airplane. I have to say that night in Sirte was one of the tougher ones because you did get you came up with the realization that no one knew who we were or where we had come from. At one point, I offered to my interrogator to transcribe our names in Arabic for him if he would take off the blindfold, and he refused. But it was a long night because you thought this might last much longer than it actually did.
Anthony Shadid, can you talk about the moment of your release? What were you understanding at the time, you and your colleagues, and how it happened?
We had been kept, and I have to say, once we arrived in Tripoli, we kind of just sprawled out in this. What we later learned was a headquarters for military intelligence. We just kind of sprawled out on the floor. We had been the beating on the tarmac in Sirte before we got on this military flight was pretty rough. And my colleague, even in Tripoli, my colleague Tyler got a pretty rough blow to the head with a gun. Once we got to this office of military intelligence, just kind of sprawled out on the floor. They gave us, of all things, milk and mango juice, and kind of got our wits back together. And even in that meeting right there, they promised us that we were going to be treated well from then on. And they held they met their promise. We were absolutely treated well from then on. We were fed well. The accommodations, it was a detention center, but it was actually quite pleasant. I think the only thing that was tough to deal with was the boredom in some ways, that we were trying to figure out what was going to happen to us. We had watched TV for a few minutes. We knew that we were still missing, but as soon as they saw our reaction to that, they cut the cable, so we didn't see TV after that, although we had heard that there was a debate over a no-fly zone. And we did worry about the implications of that. I think by the night before I'd say 2 nights before we were released, we could hear the anti-aircraft fire. We were in what they called Bab al-Azaziyah, which is the the headquarters for Colonel Qaddafi, so we figured that the no-fly zone had been imposed, that there was bombing going on. We did hear the anti-aircraft fire, and I think, 4 journalists sitting together, they're just going to let their imaginations run wild, and they did, and we were worried that we would be kept days, weeks, even longer as hostages, who knows. And again, it reminds me of what happened in Baghdad in 2003. I think a lot of journalists left Baghdad in 2003 because they feared what the Iraqi government would do. In the end, the Iraqi government did nothing to them before it fell. And I think there's a similar situation here. Again, you could tell from these officials that we talked to in Tripoli that they very much were determined to show that this was a legitimate state, that the state still had prestige, that the state would play by diplomatic rules, essentially, and they did. And the Turkish diplomats who facilitated our release were told, I think, 4 times that we were about to be freed. The 4th time we actually were, and Sunday morning we were taken, we were blindfolded as we left the compound, and then taken to the Turkish, well, we were taken to a Libyan office, and then the Turkish embassy, and from there we were driven to the Tunisian border.
And how did that feel?
It felt, well, I want to say, you felt jubilant or you felt relieved, and I'm not sure that was the feeling. I think it was more a feeling of, I don't think any of us talked all that much, to be honest. I think a lot of us had a lot of guilt over what, the fate of our driver, we still don't know what has happened to him. We fear the worst, and we talked about, that was the subject of a lot of our conversation over those 3 days in Tripoli. I think a lot of us felt guilt about what we had done to our friends and our families. We didn't know that anyone was we figured the New York Times was going to be paying attention to our case, but we didn't know that there were going to be efforts beyond that. And I think as soon as we got to Tunisia, we realized how much people had tried to help, and I think there was a deep appreciation on all our parts.
Anthony Shadid, we last spoke to you in Tunisia. This rolling rebellion that has been taking place, Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, Yemen, Libya. Can you talk about the different natures of these rebellions, different characters, and also what makes them similar, what you've observed?
I do think that Egypt and Tunisia were, in some ways, the easy revolutions. And they're revolutions that are still unfolding. I think especially Tunisia, where the demands are very pronounced over what kind of change the opposition or the revolutionaries want to see in Tunisia. I think Egypt is absolutely still a work in progress, and I think it's a fascinating one. It's not coincidence that those 2 countries have, I think, the deepest sense of national identity. The divisions within those countries are not that great or not that pronounced. I think when we look at countries elsewhere in the Arab world, it does become much more complicated in some ways. I think in Libya we have that problem that I was just talking about, the lack of any real institutions to navigate a transition. I think when we look at countries like Bahrain, Yemen, and especially Syria, there are divisions, ethnic sectarian divisions under the surface that I think frighten a lot of people, and I think especially so in Syria. I think Syria is the country that a lot of people are going to want to watch, that the implications of change there, I think, are as great as the implications were in Egypt. Syria is obviously a much smaller state. It doesn't have the power, the prestige. It doesn't have the history of Egypt. But it is at this kind of nexus of interest between Iran, Israel, Hezbollah, and Lebanon, and neighboring Lebanon. And I think any change in the calculus there, any change in the arithmetic in Syria is going to have far-reaching impacts across the region.
You are the Beirut bureau chief for the New York Times. Talk about Lebanon and Jordan.
Lebanon, how do you describe Lebanon? It's remarkable to me that amid all this change in the region, and again, it's hard to overstate how great this change and this transformation is. I think for the first time, absolutely, since I can remember, but perhaps that a lot of people can remember, the region is speaking with an indigenous vocabulary. It's speaking about its own vision. It's articulating its own vision. It's so radically, fundamentally different from the change that was, imposed on Iraq with, through invasion and violence in 2003. This is a remarkable moment, I think, in the history of the modern Arab world, and it's being articulated in a very forceful, fundamental way. In a way that's never been done before. Lebanon almost seems like a sideshow amid all these changes, and I think for a lot of Lebanese it's difficult to see societies being transformed all around them, and Lebanon's still entrenched in this centuries-old or decades-old, let's say decades-old, system of rule that in some ways makes the smallest identities, the most relevant, form of affiliation. There is an effort, I think, in Lebanon to change that, to get beyond these narrow sectarian identities and create something more, something broader, some broader notion of belonging. But those efforts are so far hamstrung. There have been a few protests, but they really haven't gone anywhere. I think Jordan is going to be more interesting. And again, Jordan, I think, falls in some ways, it falls into that arithmetic that Syria still plays by. Jordan is obviously an American ally. You don't see the American government abandoning the monarchy there anytime soon. But it's also a complicated society with its mix of Palestinians and Jordanians. The king, his wife are not popular. You keep thinking that this is going to be one of the places that we're going to see change, rather quickly, like Algeria, for instance. But it hasn't happened so far. But again, this is a years-long process, and I think it is going to take years. And like I said, I think the easy revolutions are over. Now we're in store for a much more difficult, much more precarious, but no less promising path toward fundamental change across the region.
And then can you talk about the U.S. response to these rolling rebellions? President Obama giving the major address he did in Cairo soon after he was elected to the Muslim world. And then the responses to the despots who, not just Obama, but the administrations before, had shored up for decades and holding on to the end and then seeing when it's inevitable making the shift. Can you talk about what the role has been?
Sure. I have to say, just at the outset, it's so, as a reporter in Iraq, it so much was about Iraq and America, this conflict between, obviously the United States invaded that country and the society was wrecked over a truly heartbreaking conflict that went on for years. It did strike me in Egypt, especially in Tahrir Square, absolutely there was criticism of U.S. policy, criticism of Israel, but I think fundamentally the narrative that you heard in Tahrir Square was about what kind of Egypt are we going to construct, what kind of Egypt are we going to build, what is our vision for the future, especially vis-a-vis a government that basically kind of, let's be blunt, a government that pretty much hated its people. That was remarkable to me. And again, I keep using this phrase, but it was an indigenous vocabulary. It was a narrative that was being articulated on people's own terms in Cairo and elsewhere. I think the United States almost by default feels like it has to get involved, but you get the sense being in a place like Tahrir Square that the less involved they are, the better it's going to be. I think critics out there would see a level of cynicism on how this is unfolding in terms of U.S. and Western intervention. I think it's no coincidence that France and Italy, both with interests in the future of Libya's oil, were the first to recognize Libya's opposition government, along with Qatar. And I think there's, critics are, right to point out that, we haven't seen a uniform standard in how American and Western intervention plays across the region. We saw a much more forceful response in Libya compared to what we've seen in Yemen or Bahrain. Yemen and Bahrain, obviously, both being strategic allies to the United States and the West. It is, American intervention has a pretty sad history in the Arab world, and you do wonder, how well that lesson is understood as we go forward, because it is, like I keep saying this, I hate to be repeating myself, but it is going to be much more dangerous and much more violent as we go forward. And I think there's going to almost be almost a fallback, how do I put this? There's going to be a desire to intervene, I think, as this gets more dangerous and more complicated and more violent. But I think that very intervention could very well make things worse.
In what way make it worse?
Well, what way? This is probably beyond my pay grade, but it's, I'm trying to think when it's gone well. Any time over the past, couple generations, and I don't see it necessarily going well anytime soon. It's there is a dynamic. I think that violence, especially violence imposed from abroad, imposes on these societies, and that dynamic, almost always promises unintended consequences, and it did in Iraq. It's doing that in Libya right now. I think this very prospect of what we're seeing, the violence in Libya, is going to have repercussions that are going to last for a long time, and I think that model of, or let's say those unintended consequences, are something that almost by default happen with any intervention anywhere.
Anthony, are you planning to go back to the Middle East?
You know, I'm the bureau chief in Beirut, so I'm going back next week. But like I said, Lebanon's probably the quietest place in the Middle East right now. So I do want to try to hopefully get to Egypt, rather soon. I think one of these key narratives to better understand when you look at the Arab world right now is this kind of deal that's going to be made between political Islam and power. And I think that's something that's unfolding right now. I think we're seeing it in Egypt unfold in a pretty forceful way. And it's, it's a lot less dangerous to cover something like that, and I think in some ways more interesting. So I'm hoping to try to tackle that when I get back.
What makes you keep going back? You were shot in the shoulder in the West Bank in 2002. Why do you keep going back to war zones?
Not to be flip, but it's kind of pretty much the only thing I know how to do, not cover conflict. I actually don't like covering conflict. I think you have to cover conflict when it's part of what you do cover, and I do cover the Arab world. I've been covering it for 15 years. I think now finally is the moment that we see that is transformative in the Arab world, and it does make you even more, I think, eager in some ways to cover it, to try to bring meaning to it, to witness it. And it matters, I guess. I think at each time you make these decisions, say in Baghdad in 2003 and Lebanon in 2006, as you pointed out in Ramallah in 2002, you think that if you're not there, the story won't be told. And that might be a little bit arrogant or conceited. It's absolutely it's the only way to bring altruism to the story, that it's not just about ambition, that you're trying to do something that's that's meaningful. I hope that's the case. It's probably a mix of all of them together, but you do want to, I think especially people who've been covering this for a long time and who have a sense of the place, I think those people want to have a role at least in how these stories, how these conflicts, how these uprisings are covered.
Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times foreign correspondent Anthony Shadid speaking last April. He died of an apparent asthma attack yesterday while reporting on the conflict in Syria. He's survived by his wife, New York Times reporter Nada Bakri, and 2 children. Anthony Shadid was 43 years old. To see the full interview and all of our interviews with Anthony Shadid, you can go to our website at democracynow.org.